This is Doug Bradley, welcoming you to the second volume of Spinechillers audiobooks. And before we get to the stories themselves, I'd like to say a few words about the writers and stories collected here. In fact, two of the writers, Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft, have already been introduced in Volume 1. Poe's The Oval Portrait is one of his briefest stories and visits one of his most familiar themes, the death in life and life in death of a beautiful young woman, an idea usually linked to the death of Poe's wife in her early 20s. However, Virginia died 5 years after the publication of The Oval Portrait in Graham's magazine in 1842, in a slightly longer version actually entitled Life in Death. The version read here is as it appeared, renamed The Oval Portrait, in the Broadway Journal in 1845. There may still be a premonitory link to Virginia's death in the story. 1842 was the year in which the symptoms of the consumption that would claim her life first appeared. The Tomb is one of H.P. Lovecraft's earliest adult stories, written when he was 27 and published in The Vagrant magazine 5 years later in 1922. It also happens to be the very first Lovecraft story I ever read as a teenager. I think The Tomb forms a fascinating companion piece to The Outsider, which I read for Volume 1 of this series. In The Outsider, the narrator is a denizen of the underworld intent on escaping his sunless world to seek the companionship of the living. Here, in The Tomb, the definitely human and living Jervis Dudley becomes obsessed with the idea of entering a nearby mausoleum. The opening story in this volume is The Dream Woman by Wilkie Collins, who was born in 1824 and is to be congratulated, I suppose, as being the first Spinechillers author to live beyond the age of 60, 65 to be precise. A close friend of and sometime collaborator with Charles Dickens, Collins was a hugely popular writer, with 27 novels to his name in addition to short stories, plays, and non-fiction. He led an unconventional life, trained in the law but never practiced. He lived with Caroline Graves and her young daughter but would not marry. He was steadfastly opposed to the institution of marriage. Caroline, in fact, married another man in the 1860s. Collins was present at the ceremony, but then returned to live with the author, who had by this time begun another relationship with a young woman named Martha Rudd, who bore him 3 children. His will stipulated that his estate be divided equally between the 2 women and their children. Mr. Coleridge, do not cry. If the opium really does you good, why do you not go and get it? These were the words which, supposedly, the 9-year-old Wilkie overheard his mother say to Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet. At 30, Collins began taking laudanum to relieve the pains of gout, and in his later years was a helpless addict, consuming prodigious quantities of the tincture from a hip flask which accompanied him everywhere he went. His addiction was a factor in the estrangement between him and Dickens in later years. The publishing history of The Dream Woman is a slightly tangled one. It first appeared in 1855 in the Christmas edition of a magazine called Household Words, edited by Dickens, when it was entitled The Ostler in Holly Tree Inn. 4 years later, it appeared in a collection of stories called The Queen of Hearts, now called Brother Morgan's Narrative of the Dream Woman, and then appeared in a third version in 1874, now called The Dream Woman, a Mystery in 4 Narratives, which was an expanded version, which Collins had worked up for his 1873 U.S. speaking tour, and which he published in a collection of stories called The Frozen Deep and Other Stories. For the record, I am reading the 1859 version. As the creator of arguably the most famous fictional character in all of literature, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is another writer who needs little by way of introduction. He was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, to English and Irish parents in 1859. He was educated by Jesuits but had rejected Christianity by the age of 16 before going on to study medicine at Edinburgh University and setting up a medical practice in Southsea in England, where he wrote and published a short story in 1887 called A Study in Scarlet, which introduced a certain pipe-smoking detective.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?